Au Yémen. À ce moment-là, ils se sont rapprochés, ça leur a servi à tous les deux à obtenir des soutiens à l'international, notamment dans le Golfe, qui leur a permis de devenir les nouveaux leaders de la partie militaire.
Because
of land is about 5 acres, which is about 5 football fields, and that is how much land you're growing spinach on.
Yeah, I'm doing a bit by bit, so I haven't planted the whole land because of shortage of water and tractors. So I'm using a hoe to plant. So I haven't planted.
Because that would be a lot of land, 5 acres, 5 football.
Just on the weekends when they are off.
Wow. That's
toxins that the expert panel could find.
If there was a pathogen, shouldn't we be really worried about it? Because the level of movement coming in and out of the port means that's travelling around the country, around the world.
Et Hakim a ce petit truc qui nous voilà.
Petite attention, vas-y.
Petite attention, exactement.
Jakiego Ukrainie udziela Polska i cały demokratyczny świat. Gorąco polecamy ten cykl już od wczoraj aż do 20.
In 2021, but one thing that I think is important is that scientifically we are more ready if there were to be another incident like this.
Professor Gideon Henderson speaking to me on Countryfile last night. Joe Redfern represents the North East Fishing Collective.
Well, it leaves us with more questions than answers, unfortunately, and while the dredging continues, it leaves us waiting to see what happens.
Do you think actually Professor Gideon Henderson is perhaps right when he says we'll probably never know for definite what this was?
Well, there is going to be elements of uncertainty, as with everything, but to come out with a unevidenced alternative theory just seems wild to me. You know, we should be putting all our resources into trying to understand the thread of evidence that we have as completely as possible, and unfortunately that's not being done.
So you think, despite what the independent inquiry has said, that this is down to dredging?
Yeah, why aren't we doing core hole testing into the sediment? Why aren't we testing that sediment before it is dumped at sea, or at least, you know, regularly every week testing a bit of that sediment and analysing it before then dumping it at sea?
The government, though, has no plans to do that because they accept the independent panel's report. Is that something that you or scientists working on your behalf could or would do?
Yeah, when it shouldn't be our responsibility to do so, but we're crowdfunding through the fishermen's associations, we're working with local universities, we're trying to get the permissions in place to get that sampling done, but, you know, a big barrier is cost.
Is there a point at which you and fishermen along the coast just have to accept that you may never know for certain what caused this?
Yeah, there is, and if the testing comes back as clean and they test for pyridine and find that pyridine isn't toxic in the levels that they detect, that's when we'll all hold our hands up and say we accept that the dredging can continue and it's safe to do so. But unfortunately there's no monitoring and no sampling being done at this time, so we're left waiting to see the impact to the marine life rather than being ahead of the game and trying to monitor it.
What's the situation at the moment? Crab and lobster populations?
Just completely devastated around the Tees estuary. Just complete devastation, just loss of earnings, boats going up for sale, crew leaving the industry. You know, it's game over for those guys around there. Further afield, like down to Whitby, where I am, the fishing has continued, albeit that the crab numbers have been really heavily impacted.
Joe Redfern there from the North East Fishing Collective. That's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The studio manager is Nick Ford and the producer for BBC Audio in Bristol is Heather Simons. Now over to the BBC Weather Centre for the Farming Today 5-day forecast.
Good morning, this is Nick Miller with you today. This week's weather is looking mild, increasingly so in England and Wales, although still with the risk of frost at first this week. Settled at first with high pressure nearby, but as that moves away eastwards, low pressure will take over. That will advance some weather fronts into the UK as the week goes on, bringing some rain and some windier weather at times too, with the risk of gales. Here's the detail day by day, and today, under the influence of high pressure, a dry, breezier day with sunny spells developing more widely compared with the weekend, though eastern counties of England will remain rather cloudy. Tonight likely to be the coldest night of the week, a more widespread frost through much of England and Wales, away from westernmost counties, and also for eastern Scotland. On Tuesday, whilst England and Wales stay mainly dry, for Scotland and Northern Ireland, cloudier skies with a chance of showers. On Tuesday night, England and Wales keep clear spells with the risk of patchy frost. For the rest of the week, it's looking mainly frost-free. Early on Wednesday, another weather front in Scotland and Northern Ireland will bring a spell of heavier rain eastwards, and this will then push across England and Wales as the day goes on. That will be weakening as it does so. With some uncertainty about how this more unsettled weather pattern progresses, on Thursday, England and Wales has a chance of seeing some more widespread wet weather moving through for a time. And then on Thursday night into Friday, low pressure is expected to move over or close by Scotland, bringing some wet and windy weather with gales across northern areas of the UK. Scotland could also see a spell of snow on hills. Now, the low pressure is expected to clear on Friday as skies 12 degrees Celsius, with the potential for England and Wales to reach 14 to 16 degrees at times. So a mild week by day, initially a risk of frost, high pressure to begin the week with a lot of settled weather, then low pressure taking over with an increasing chance of rain and windier conditions too. That's how it's looking. Charles.
Nick Miller. This is BBC Radio 4, 2 minutes to 6. Time now for Tweet of the Day. Michaela Strachan presents the white-tailed eagle.
The white-tailed eagle, or sea eagle, is our largest breeding bird of prey, and in flight it's been described as looking like a flying barn door. These large birds use favourite perches and lookout posts around their territory. After observing them for some time, one of our sound recordists, Chris Watson, fixed a microphone close by a perch and then ran a cable back to a recording position several hundred metres away. He waited for a bird to return, and when it did, he captured these loud and dynamic contact calls. The birds were persecuted over a long period of time because they were suspected of taking young lambs and fish. By 1916, there were no breeding birds left here. Since 1975, though, a long-term reintroduction plan involving birds from Norway has proved successful, and there are now up to 50 pairs of whitetails nesting on several of the Western Isles of Scotland. The adults have white tail feathers, a bulky yellow bill, and long parallel-sided wings. They really do deserve that barn door description.
The tweet of the white-tailed eagle. Tomorrow's bird doesn't really tweet either. It's more of a churring sound. What is it? We'll find out at 2 minutes to 6 tomorrow. On FM, on longwave, on digital and on BBC Sounds. This is BBC Radio 4.
It's 6 o'clock on Monday the 13th of February. Good morning. This is Today with Amol Rajan and Michelle Hussain.
The headlines this morning. The Pentagon says it's been unable to determine how 3 unidentified objects shot down in North American airspace were able to stay aloft. The United States has called on Syria and opposition groups within the country to allow humanitarian aid to access areas devastated by last week's earthquakes. Also in today's programme, is the UK's preeminence in the field of life sciences being put at risk? We'll be speaking to one of the creators of Oxford's COVID-19 vaccine. The poet Michael Rosen tells us how loss and heartbreak have helped him find resilience, even strength, in dark times. And
this whole damn world upside down.
As the suffragette movement is given the Hamilton treatment, is musical theatre increasingly taking inspiration from the history books? The BBC News is read by Charles Carroll.
US military officials say they've been unable to determine how 3 unidentified flying objects shot out of the skies of North America over the past few days were able to stay aloft. Fighter jets brought down what was described as an octagonal object drifting over the state of Michigan yesterday. 2 other devices have been destroyed in Alaska and Canada. The Pentagon said it hadn't yet been able to definitely assess the 3, but said they were different from the Chinese surveillance balloon downed off the coast of South Carolina. Here's our North America correspondent, Peter Bowes.
The Pentagon says American airspace has been scrutinized more closely following the shooting down of the Chinese balloon, and that may partly explain the increase in objects that have been detected over the past week. President Biden again issued the order for the latest to be taken down over Lake Huron on the US-Canada border. We're calling them objects, not balloons, for a reason, said General Glenn Van Herk, the head of North American Aerospace Defense Command. He explained that it still wasn't clear how they were being propelled through the air or where they were coming from.
The United States has joined calls for humanitarian workers to be allowed to access parts of Syria devastated by last week's earthquakes. The White House said aid must be permitted to reach all affected areas without delay. The UN said yesterday that aid being transported from government-held regions of the country to areas controlled by opposition groups had been held up by approval issues with one hardline group. Caroline
killed across Syria and Turkey has topped more than 33,000. 3,500 of those deaths have been reported in Syria, but those numbers have not been updated for 2 days. Rescue teams and aid convoys have struggled to reach those in need in a country still divided by a now 12-year civil war. Washington has now called on all parties in Syria to allow humanitarian assistance through the country's borders, urging President Bashar al-Assad to grant blanket authorization for humanitarian deliveries.
Detectives investigating the death of a 16-year-old girl at a park in Warrington have arrested 2 teenagers. Brianna Jai was found lying on a path with multiple stab wounds on Saturday. A boy and a girl, both aged 15 and from the local area, are in custody. The body that represents pharmacists in England has warned that people are going without prescription medications because they can't afford to pay for them. The Royal Pharmaceutical Society says it's seen a rise in the number of patients not collecting medicine in the last 6 months. The government insists it's taken steps to help people with the cost and says nearly 89% of NHS prescription items are free. But the Society's chair, Torrin Govin, said that nobody should have to pay.
The current exemption situation, which means that some patients don't have to pay, doesn't make sense. It was made years ago, it doesn't reflect the current times, it isn't up to date, and really, we just need to just completely. It's unfair, it's a tax on the sick. We've seen a rise in patients not collecting their prescriptions, and really this is part of the cost of living crisis.
More employers expect to raise pay this year to recruit and retain staff. A survey by the Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development, which advocates for better working lives, found that more than half of firms asked said they expected to cover the increased cost of wages by raising prices. Our business correspondent, Ben King, has more.
The UK economy has been struggling with a shortage of workers, with low unemployment, record vacancy levels, and firms raising wages to attract and retain staff. This survey of just over 2,000 employers suggests they're increasingly expecting to pass those higher costs on to customers by raising prices rather than accepting lower profits, potentially making it harder for the Bank of England to control inflation. 7 out of 10 firms expect to hire new staff in coming months, but more than half have vacancies which they are finding it hard to fill. They're covering the gaps by boosting the skills of existing staff and increasing their duties.
Female performers have dominated this year's What's on Stage Theatre Awards. In the first year, the acting categories have been gender neutral. Women won the 2 lead and both supporting prizes. The awards are decided entirely by theatre goers, as Guy Lambert reports.
Those behind the What's on Stage Awards say they're proud to be the first theatre honours to introduce gender-neutral categories. On the night, it was female performers who triumphed in the 4 major awards. Killing Eve won Best Performer in a Play for Prima Facie, a role she'll reprise on Broadway later this year. Courtney Bowman won Best Performer in a Musical for her role in Legally Blonde. And the RSC's production of My Neighbor Totoro, an adaptation of the Japanese fantasy animation, was the biggest winner of the night, taking home 5 awards from 9 nominations, including Best Direction and Best Set Design.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to Nick Miller now with the weather forecast. Morning, Nick. How's it looking?
Yeah, good morning. Mild this week. Dry to begin with high pressure. Low pressure taking over from midweek, so an increasing chance of some rain and some windier weather too, with a risk of gales on Friday. I said mild, still cold enough for a touch of frost here and there as we begin the week. It's -2 in Edinburgh, -4 at Reedsdale Camp in Northumberland at the moment. So there is a frost out there where skies have been clear, though for much of the UK it's cloudy, and so we're above freezing. It's 4 degrees in Glasgow, 6 in London and 7 for Cardiff and Belfast at the moment. It's dry across the UK today, and for southwest England, Wales, the Midlands and northwest England, even where you are starting with some cloud, increasing sunny spells as the day goes on a breezier day. For southeast England, eastern England and northeast England, many places getting off to a cloudy start. There's some sunny spells across parts of Kent, the far northeast of England, and sunny spells developing more widely today, though easternmost counties could well hold on to cloud well into the afternoon. For Northern Ireland, a breezier day, quite a bit of cloud around, but there are some breaks developing and will continue to do so, so a few sunny spells here and there. And in Scotland, parts of the central belt, southwest Scotland keeping some cloud, elsewhere some sunny spells on a breezier day. And temperatures Scotland, Northern Ireland, Northern England, 8 to 11 degrees Celsius. For the rest of England and for Wales, 10 to 13 degrees today. And tonight, a more widespread frost for England and Wales away from western counties, and for eastern Scotland too.
Nick, thank you very much indeed. Let's have a look at this morning's papers and what's on the news websites. And the Daily Telegraph leads on the security review to be carried out by the UK in response to the incursion of what it calls Chinese spy balloons into Western airspace. It explains that Britain will share and analyse intelligence with allies including the US. The Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, is quoted saying the appearance of the balloons is another sign of how the global threat picture is changing for the worse.
The New York Times website reflects a sense of bafflement in the US about the other unidentified flying objects that have been shot down over the country in recent days. What's going on up there? Asks its headline. It says there are theories but no answers about the mystery craft. Both the Pentagon and intelligence agencies are reported to have stepped up investigations of unexplained incidents around military bases. The online edition of the Washington Post says that pressure is mounting for the White House to reveal what it knows.
The Times suggests the government is backing away from the idea of fining water firms up to £250 million for spilling sewage into rivers. The paper says a forthcoming consultation on the plans will provide an opportunity to weaken them after regulators describe the penalties as crazy. The Times is launching a campaign. It's called Clean It Up, pushing for action to safeguard.
The Eye also leads on pollution, saying that Rishi Sunak is facing a Tory rebellion over clean water regulations.
And in the Mail, the former Brexit Minister Lord Frost warns that a secret summit of politicians and business leaders held last week at a stately home in Oxfordshire shows an intention to row back on the deal that he helped to negotiate.
The time is now 6:10.
And let's turn to that latest shooting down, which Michelle mentioned in the review there of the papers, of this curious unidentified flying object over America. This time, an object was shot down near Lake Huron in Michigan. A short time ago, I spoke to Brett Dahlberg. He's from Michigan Radio, and I asked him what we know about it so far.
It's been described by the Pentagon as very small, which makes it really difficult to track, really difficult for pilots to see. We definitely don't know what it is, and that's one of the things that the Defense Department says that it still needs to figure out.
For those of us who aren't totally familiar with that particular part of Michigan. Can you just describe the area where this airborne object was shot down, and in particular the fact that there were a number of sensitive defense sites that it seems to have flown over?
It was shot down over Lake Huron, which is on the eastern side of Lake Michigan, about 15 miles off the coast of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, which is a largely rural area. On the way there, it tracked over Lake Michigan to the west and Wisconsin, a state further west. And the Defense Department says it's very likely the same object that seemed to be loitering over military installations in Montana a few days ago. And so while the military doesn't know what it is, or at least won't communicate what they believe it is, it was cause enough for concern that the go-ahead was given to bring it down.
And up to an aspect of perhaps espionage and China's surveillance operations, which it hadn't really given sufficient consideration to before.
All we know at this point about espionage is that the Chinese surveillance object. What we don't know is what the next three, the much smaller ones, are. And the military was really clear today that there's a big difference between that large balloon that was brought down that was about 2 and these much smaller objects that have been brought down in recent days.
Brett Dahlberg from Michigan Radio, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Quite intriguing, all of that. We'll be looking at it more immediately now. At 12 minutes past 6, police officers have travelled from the UK to uncover more about a death it is suspected may not have been natural. Jonathan Head, our Southeast Asia correspondent, joins us, having followed this story. First of all, Jonathan, what do we know about this woman?
Well, her name is Lamdoan Armitage. She was married to a British man, children. That's about Lamdoan herself, is that her body was found right up at a very high part of the Yorkshire Dales, back in 2004 by hikers. But at that stage they couldn't identify who she was. They did manage to ascertain that she was probably East Asian. It took a long time before they began to piece together the nationality, and there was quite a lot of detective work involved. And it was only when her parents saw a report on the BBC and BBC Thai language service in 2019, that's 15 years after she disappeared, that they came forward and said that she'd gone missing, and they believed it was her. And through DNA analysis, they were able to identify her. Now, in the meantime, her husband, David Armitage, we don't know what the state of about her disappearance or her death, has refused to speak about it. And the North Yorkshire detectives initially left with what they thought was an open verdict. They thought it was possible she just got lost and died of exposure on the hills, decided to reopen the case. They now believe there are reasons to consider the possibility that her death was unnatural, and they're here in Thailand after a long delay. That COVID delayed their trip by 3 years to try and get more information from her family and those who knew her to see whether that can push their investigation forward.
It is a really extraordinary tale, the fact that she was unidentified for so long.
It is, and rather movingly, I mean, because she wasn't known, nobody knew who she was. The local community, and then indeed, everyone else started referring to her just as the Lady of the Hills. They found a burial place for her not far from where she was found at a churchyard, and she's been there in an unknown grave. Now, once her identity was established, one of her family members, she comes from quite a poor background in the northeast of Thailand, was able to come over with a couple of friends and visit the grave, but her parents have never been able to do so. So one of the things the police will be talking to them about is the possibility of moving her remains back to Thailand so they can have a much delayed funeral for her.
Jonathan Head in Bangkok, thank you.
It is just coming up to 6:15 as the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine nears. Could the European gas crisis that it brought about be over? Fliss is in Salford with more on this and the rest of today's business news. Morning, Fliss.
Morning. Yes, this is the claim from one of the world's top-performing energy traders. Pierre Andurand told the Financial Times that Vladimir Putin has lost the energy war and that Europe no longer has to fear an energy crisis. Now, of course, his comments come after Russia announced on Friday it would be reducing its oil output by around 500,000 barrels a day in response to sanctions. Let's talk to Chris Weafer, who's a Eurasia-based business and investment strategist and the chief executive of the consultancy Macro Advisory. Chris, good morning.
Good morning.
So has Putin lost the energy war, and what does that even mean?
Yeah, actually, that's a really good question. What does it mean? Because there's no evidence that part of the Russia's strategy a year ago, when the invasion started, was to provoke an energy war. I think that's something that happened as a consequence of the bigger decision. But look, going to the nub of it, as it were, is Europe now out of the woods in terms of a gas crisis? And the answer really is no. It is this year. For sure, Europe will not have a gas crisis and really shouldn't see any spike in gas prices for the remainder of this winter or coming into the spring. But there's a huge question mark over what will be the position coming into next winter, because for two reasons. One is Europe was in a strong position this year because it was able to buy a significant amount of LNG gas that would normally have gone to China last year, but China didn't want it because it was in COVID zero, it was in COVID lockdown, and therefore energy demand was low. Secondly, Russian gas flows into Europe up to last summer, were at a high level, which meant that the reserve tanks were able to be filled, and therefore stocks were high. And then, of course, the weather has been good. But coming into next winter, we already see that China is now back in the market. It has eliminated the COVID lockdown. It's now a big energy buyer again. Europe will not be able to buy the same volume of LNG, and it will not have the Russian gas building up the reserves as normally happens in the summer. So a big question mark over next winter and possibly the winter after that, before what Europe is now doing in terms of alternatives and build-up of LNG supplies from other places, before that leaves the continent in a more comfortable position. There's about 2 more years of this potential risk.
About 2 more years is not necessarily what we wanted to hear, and I should say LNG, of course, liquefied natural gas. We saw this announcement from Russia that it was reducing its oil exports by 500,000 barrels a day. Do Russia's actions still affect the energy markets in general?
Yeah, well, we've got to wait to see, because the situation has now changed materially as of last week, when Europe put in the second ban. It was a ban on oil products, and that's a much bigger volume of oil. About 2.8 million barrels of Russian oil products have been going into Europe over the previous 6 months. Russia has been able to divert a lot of the crude that was banned from December the 5th to other markets in India and China, but it does not have the infrastructure in terms of tankers or pipes or rail cars to sell the oil products elsewhere. So by our estimate, and the International Energy Agency also the same, reckons that Russia will lose between 1 million and 1.5 million barrels a day of production and exports during the next couple of months. So if you take that out of the global market, at the same time, as I mentioned, that China's economy is now recovering, which could add about 1 million barrels a day of demand, then you can see there's potentially going to be a big squeeze in the oil markets, perhaps in Q2 coming into the summer, and that's the basis of a lot of expectations that the price of oil will go back up over $100 again in that period. But Russia physically will probably lose at least 1 million barrels. This is now just the first announcement, and probably more like 1.5 million.
Before you go, you're not in Moscow today. You are usually based there.
Yes.
After almost a year of those sanctions, international sanctions being really stepped up, is Moscow looking and feeling any different?
No, it's not. There was a period, and certainly there were several periods,